So here's a practice problem to get you ready for assignment number 19. Here in chapter 10, we're looking at hypothesis testing. This time we've got two samples of data representing two different populations, and we're wanting to compare either the means or the proportions of populations. So we want to look to the write-up to get a clue, and if we look what we're testing, we're conducting a test using these significance levels of whether food expenditure in Seattle is more than in Portland. And looking back further in the write-up, we see that what we're given is average weekly food expenditure in Seattle and in Portland, right? So this is going to indicate that we are looking for a test of means. All right, now we're going to want to get to the place where we are going through the 4 steps, right? The first step being the null and alternate hypotheses. Before that, though, let's fill in the table with the different pieces of information that we are given. All right, so for Seattle, what is the sample mean expenditure? And that is given to us as 164 with a standard deviation of 1250. And sample size of 35. All right, now let's look at for Portland. We've got a mean expenditure, sample mean expenditure of 159, standard deviation of 925, with sample size of 30. Okay, so now we can just refer back to those values as we go through the process of testing. So when we write down the null and alternate hypothesis for this kind of test, where we are testing the means from 2 separate populations, all right, which are populations are Seattle and Portland, the null is always going to be that there is no difference in the mean values. Or in terms of the symbols, mu1 and mu2, we've got mu1 minus mu2 is equal to 0, right? The 0 is, the difference is 0 between those two. And then in the alternate, we're going to have that it is either not equal to 0 or it is greater than 0 or less than 0. All right, since we are asking if the food expenditure in Seattle is more than in Portland, this is going to be a greater than 0. All right, because mu1, it represents Seattle, and we're asking if it is greater than mu2, which represents Portland. So mu1 minus mu2 then would be greater than 0. It would be positive. The test statistic for this test is a t-value. It is x bar 1 minus x bar 2, right? The 2 sample means from our samples minus 0. Right, and that 0 value is that value that we're comparing that difference to in the null hypothesis. And in this denominator, we have the square root of sample standard deviation from the first sample squared, which is the variance, sample variance, over the sample size from the first sample, plus sample 2 standard deviation squared, or the sample 2 variance over the sample size of sample 2. So plugging values in, we're going to get t equal to 164 minus 159 minus 0 over the square root of 12.5 squared divided by 35 plus 9.25 squared over 30. Plugging that into the calculator, we end up with 1.849 for the test statistic. To find the p-value, we're going to use a couple of calculators from online. And the first one is to calculate the degrees of freedom. From the video, you might see that it's a pretty complicated formula, and so we're not going to actually use that formula. We're going to let the computer do the work for us. So we're going to compute the degrees of freedom using this online tool. There's a link for this on Foxtail. And you can see that it is for degrees of freedom for t-test comparing means of two independent samples. And that is what we've got in this problem. So we need to plug in these different values. So for the first sample, we've got sample size of 35. Second sample size is 30. The standard deviation for the first sample is 12.5. And for the second sample, it is 9.25. And we hit compute degrees of freedom. That gives us degrees of freedom of 61.764. And we're going to round that down to degrees of freedom of 61. All right, we are done with that calculator. And now we're going to use another online calculator to find the p-value. We're going to use the same p-value calculator we used for the previous chapter where we had just one sample. All right, we want to plug in the t-score. So the t-value we have is 1.849. And here's where we plug in our degrees of freedom that we just calculated with the other tool. And we plug in our 61. And this is a one-tailed test, so we leave that as one-tailed, and now we can calculate our p-value, and 0.34653. Now let's look at the conclusion for the test. We're looking at two different values of alpha. We'll start with 0.05. So our p-value, if we round to 3 decimal places, is 0.035. That is less than that significance level of 0.05. So that means that we are going to reject the null. All right, we are going to conclude that the mean expenditure in Seattle on groceries per week is not the same as that in Portland. And our second significance level, alpha equals 0.01, again, we make the comparison. 0.035 this time is greater than that significance level. So we do not reject. The null hypothesis that the mean expenditure in Portland and Seattle is the same.